The candles went out one by one, not from wind, not from breath, but from something older and darker moving through the hall. Stone walls held their silence the way they always had, the way they had been holding secrets for 300 years without complaint. Something dripped in the dark, water, or maybe not water, slow and deliberate, counting down to an event no one had announced. The throne room was empty, or it appeared empty. Appearances in this kingdom had always been its most practiced and most dangerous lie. Footsteps, soft, careful, the footsteps of someone who had learned very young that sound could get you killed, crossed the marble floor. The crown sat on its velvet pillow where it always sat, untouched, gleaming, patient as a predator that has all the time in the world. It was beautiful. Everything deadly in this kingdom was beautiful. That was the first lesson, learned usually too late, always at enormous cost. A hand reached for it in the dark, then stopped, fingers hovering, trembling, an inch away from the thing that changed everything it touched. Somewhere above, in the tower room, a second hand was also reaching, for a different crown, on a different pillow, in a different kind of dark. Two crowns, two hands, two destinies folding toward each other like the blades of a pair of shears closing on something caught between them. The kingdom had two heirs, everyone knew this. What everyone did not know was that both of them knew exactly what the other intended. The night was long, the knives were sharp, the ancient prophecy carved into the foundation stone had always been there, always waiting to be fulfilled. A raven landed on the window ledge outside, tilted its head, blinked one oil-black eye at the figure standing in the dark below. Ravens in this kingdom were never simply ravens. The old ones said they carried the memories of every king and queen who had ever bled. Something shifted in the air, pressure, thickness, the particular weight that gathers before lightning decides to speak, and both heirs felt it simultaneously. They had felt this before, the two of them, this invisible thread that connected them across walls and floors and years of deliberate distance. It was not love, or it was not only love, it was something more complicated, more dangerous, more ancient than that four-letter simplification. It was the feeling of two people who were made from the same darkness, who recognized each other across a crowded room full of candles and lies. Whatever was coming had been coming for a long time. The kingdom had simply been holding its breath, pretending it hadn't felt the pressure building. And now the breath was about to break, and both of them knew it, and neither of them moved, and the candles stayed dead. Her name was Isolde, second-born, shadow-raised, the daughter the king had hidden behind curtains and silence and carefully managed public indifference for 20 years. His name was Kale, firstborn, crown promised, the son the kingdom had been handed as its future since the moment he drew his first breath. They were not siblings, that is the first thing to understand. The crown passed by bloodline, but the blood between them was not shared. Kale's mother had been a queen, Isolde's mother had been a secret, which meant Isolde herself had been a secret, until secrets get too large to keep. She had grown up in the Eastern Tower, with books and a half-blind tutor and the particular education of someone being prepared for a life of watching. He had grown up in the Great Hall, in the full light of ceremony and expectation, shaped by hands that never let him forget what he was for. They had met exactly 7 times before this night, 7 meetings, each one brief, each one conducted under the surveillance of people invested in their mutual suspicion. The first time, they were 12 and 14 respectively, she had looked at him the way she looked at problems, with focus, without flinching, without giving anything away. He had looked back the way he looked at threats, which meant he had looked at her with absolute attention, and never quite managed to stop. 7 meetings, 7 silences between them thick with everything neither of them was permitted to say, 7 moments of recognizing something in the other that the court feared. And now the king was dead, 3 days, poisoned, method unknown, suspects numerous, suspects possibly including both of them, certainly including one of them, possibly neither. The throne could not sit empty. The kingdom's laws were exact on this point, merciless in their precision, indifferent to grief or politics or the living. The older heir was Kale, the law was the law, the crown should have been on his head before the king's body was cold. But the High Council had paused, hesitated, called for deliberation, which meant someone on the council knew something, or suspected something, or was being paid to delay. Isolde had received a note slipped under her door 2 nights ago, and signed, written in a hand she did not recognize, in an ink that smelled of iron. It said only, "The crown carries a curse that the firstborn cannot survive. Come to the throne room at midnight. Come alone. Come prepared to choose." She had read it 6 times, she had burned it, she had stood at her window for an hour watching the courtyard below for whoever might be watching her. She was prepared, she was always prepared. The Eastern Tower had given her time, and time had given her the habit of thinking 3 moves ahead at minimum. Kale had received no note, but he had received something else, a memory, surfacing without warning on the morning of his father's death, from a conversation 2 years prior. His father had come to his chambers late at night, slightly unsteady, smelling of the strong southern wine he drank only when something was eating him from inside. He had sat down in the chair by the window without being invited, which was the king's prerogative, and had said, without preamble, without explanation, "Don't wear the crown alone." Kale had asked what he meant. The king had stood, straightened, become the king again, closed, formal, armored, and said nothing more, and left without looking back. "Don't wear the crown alone," 4 words, delivered and never explained, and now the man who said them was in the ground and the crown was waiting. Kale was not afraid, he had been trained specifically not to be afraid, but he was careful, which was the intelligent substitute for fear that kings preferred. He had dismissed his guards at 11:30, casually, convincingly, with a plausible excuse, and made his way down the back corridor toward the throne room in the dark. He arrived to find the candles already dead, which was wrong. The throne room candles were maintained, lit always, part of the unbroken tradition of sovereignty and light. He stood in the doorway for a moment, reading the dark the way he had been taught to read a battlefield, exits, shadows, sources of sound, sources of threat. Then he heard breathing, slow, controlled, deliberately quiet, from the far side of the room, near the pillar to the left of the throne, where the dark was deepest. "I know you're there," he said, not loudly, not harshly, calmly, the way you speak to something you want to understand before you decide how to handle it. A pause, then Isolde stepped out of the shadow, her expression exactly what it always was when she faced him, composed, watchful, giving nothing, taking everything in. She was dressed in dark traveling clothes, not the court gowns she wore to formal appearances. She had come prepared for something that might require moving quickly. "You got a note," he said, not a question. He could read her posture the way she read his, which was another thing neither of them had asked for. "You got a warning," she said, also not a question. She had been watching the angles, and she knew when someone arrived from the back corridor without guards. They stood 12 feet apart in the dead candle dark, and the crown sat between them on its velvet pillow, and nobody moved toward it, and nobody moved away. "Are you going to take it?" he asked, and his voice was level, and his hand was relaxed at his side, and he was watching every micro-movement she made. "Are you?" she returned, and her voice was equally level, and she was watching him with the same granular attention he was giving her, 2 mirrors facing each other. My father told me not to wear it alone, Kale said, which was more than he had intended to offer, which meant something in him had decided she could be trusted with it. Isolde absorbed this without moving. Something behind her eyes shifted, recognition, recalibration, and she said, "The note said the firstborn cannot survive it. Someone wanted me to take it from you." The implication hung between them, clear, cold, precise, that someone had written that note specifically to put Isolde's hands on the crown before Kale could claim it himself. "Someone tried to frame you for my coronation," he said slowly, working it out as he spoke, because he was the kind of person who thought better when the words were outside him. "Or tried to frame you for refusing it," she said, "by giving me a reason to want it badly enough to take it before you could stop me." They looked at each other across the 12 feet of marble and dark, and something shifted between them, not warmth exactly, but the particular respect of two intelligent people who have just realized they are on the same side of a trap. "Who hated us both enough to play us against each other?" Kale asked, though he had already begun assembling candidates in his mind, ranking them by motive, by access, by the specific flavor of malice required. "The council," Isolde said immediately. "Specifically the 3 who voted against my recognition last spring. Specifically the one who benefits most from a succession crisis. Lord Aldrich," she didn't say the name, but they both arrived at it simultaneously, and the simultaneous arrival of the same answer was its own kind of confirmation. Aldrich, who had served 3 kings, outlasted 2 queens, accumulated enough quiet power to constitute a 4th branch of government that no one had officially named. Aldrich, who had been first to the king's bedside when the poison took effect, first to assess, first to call for a physician, first to begin the narrative of what had happened. Aldrich, who had everything to gain from a throne that passed through chaos rather than order, through crisis rather than clean succession, through 2 heirs who destroyed each other. "He poisoned the king," Isolde said, not a question this time either, not a supposition, a conclusion, stated with the flat certainty of someone who had been doing the arithmetic for days. "And set the board for one of us to take the blame," Kale said, "or for both of us to destroy each other taking the crown, and leave him to manage whatever was left." The throne room was very quiet, the raven was still on the ledge, the dripping sound had stopped, as if even the castle was listening to what they were working out. "We can't prove it tonight," Isolde said, practical, direct, the voice of someone who had learned that truth without evidence was just another opinion in a room full of powerful people. "No," Kale agreed. "But we can change the board he set." She raised an eyebrow, a small movement, precisely calibrated. She was not a person who wasted expression. "There's a precedent," he said, and she could hear him building towards something, choosing his words with the care of someone laying a path across unstable ground. "A dual coronation," he said. 7th reign of Edric the Indecisive, 2 heirs contested, neither could be disproved. The council voted to crown them both rather than let the kingdom split. Isolde was quiet for a moment. She was reading every angle of this, the way she read everything, looking for the part where she was being played, because she had been played before. "That precedent requires mutual consent," she said carefully, "and a petition to the High Council, which is currently under the control of the man who wants us both destroyed." "The petition doesn't require the council's immediate approval," Kale said. "It requires 2 witnesses of noble rank, a written declaration, and the laying of both hands on the crown simultaneously." Isolde looked at the crown on its pillow. The crown looked back, the way beautiful and dangerous things always seem to look back, patient, interested, waiting for what you'll do next. "2 twisted crowns," she said softly, almost to herself, the old phrase, the one in the foundation stones, the prophecy that had been decorating the castle's mythology for 300 years. He looked at her sharply. She met his gaze without flinching. The prophecy doesn't say 2 crowns destroy each other, she said. It says 2 crowns twisted together become stronger than either one worn alone. Everyone interpreted it as a warning, Cale said slowly. Everyone interpreted it to serve their own interests, she corrected, with a precision that was quiet and absolute. The people in power decided it meant conflict because conflict served them better than cooperation. He looked at her for a long moment. He was deciding something. She could see the architecture of the decision in the set of his jaw, the stillness of his hands. You've read the original inscription, he said. I've read everything, she said simply. I had a great deal of time in the Eastern Tower and very little else to do with it. Something crossed his face, not quite guilt, not quite apology, but the acknowledgement of a person who has just been reminded of a debt they cannot easily repay. I need 2 witnesses, he said. I have one, my steward, who is loyal and discreet and currently waiting outside the south corridor on my instruction. I have one as well, Isolde said, and she moved to the door and knocked 3 times in a specific pattern, and a woman slipped silently into the room. The woman was perhaps 50, gray-streaked, with the bearing of someone who had served a long time without ever being properly acknowledged for the service. My tutor, Isolde said. Marin. She has known about this night since I received the note. I trust her with everything, including the parts of everything that could get us both killed. Cale's steward entered from the south corridor, younger, nervous, but steady in the way that deeply loyal people are steady, which is, from the bones outward, not the surface inward. 4 people in the throne room now, the dead candles, the crown, the raven on the ledge, and a decision that would either save the kingdom or splinter it past repair. Cale moved to the crown first. He stood before it, looking down at it, and she saw him breathe, a long, full breath, the way people breathe before they step off edges. Isolde moved to stand beside him. They were shoulder to shoulder now, the closest they had ever physically stood, and the air between them was charged and complicated and alive. I want to say something first, he said, not looking at her, still looking at the crown. She waited. I spent 20 years being told you were a threat, he said. A rival. An inconvenience at best, a conspiracy at worst. I believed it longer than I should have. She absorbed this the way she absorbed most things, quietly, without rushing to fill the space it left. I spent 20 years being told I didn't exist, she said, after a moment. Being a threat was actually a promotion. He made a sound. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it carried the same release that laughter carries, the surprised, involuntary exhale of someone who has been caught off guard by honesty. After tonight, he said, if this works, if we can build a case against Aldrich and hold the council long enough to establish the dual claim, it will not be easy. It will be the hardest thing either of us has ever done, she agreed, and we'll have to do it together, which means we'll have to trust each other, which neither of us has any practice at. I know, he said. I know you know, she said. I'm saying it anyway, so that later, when it's difficult, when we disagree, when one of us wants to take the easy path and cut the other loose, we remember that we said it out loud. Here. Tonight. He turned and looked at her then, really looked, the way he hadn't allowed himself to in any of the 7 meetings, because looking had always felt dangerous, and dangerous things required control. She looked back, the same way, with the same quality of seeing, and for a moment the crowns and the council and the dead king and the living conspiracy all receded. Two people. Throne room. Midnight. The particular gravity of being seen by someone who has every reason to look away and has chosen not to. Together, then, he said. Together, she agreed. They each placed a hand on the crown, his right, her left, and the metal was cold, and then it was warm, and then it was something that had no comfortable temperature at all. The two witnesses moved forward. Marin spoke the ancient words in the old language, her voice steady as bedrock, as if she had been rehearsing this moment for years, because she had. The steward signed the declaration with a hand that shook only slightly. Marin signed it with a hand that did not shake at all, and it was done, and it was witnessed, and it was real. The raven on the ledge spread its wings once, a single, deliberate movement, and then folded them back, and stayed, as if it had been waiting for exactly this and was now satisfied. Cale lifted the crown. It was heavier than it looked. They always are. The things we reach for, they always turn out to weigh more than we calculated when we were still only reaching. He set it not on his own head, he held it between them, in the space between his hands and hers, equidistant, belonging to neither and both simultaneously. We'll have it recast, Isolde said, looking at it, and there was something in her voice that was not greed and not pride but something more patient than both of those. Into two, he said, understanding her immediately, which was already becoming a habit, which was something neither of them was quite prepared for. Into two that fit together, she said. Two twisted crowns. Let them see what the prophecy actually meant, when it was read by someone who wasn't afraid of what it was saying. What followed, Aldrich's unraveling, which took 4 months, and the testimony of a physician who had been bribed into silence and subsequently had a crisis of conscience, was methodical and surgical. Isolde had kept notes in the Eastern Tower, not just books, but observations, records, the quiet accumulation of a person who watched the court from outside it and saw things the insiders missed. Cale had relationships, with soldiers, with tradespeople, with the steward who knew where every body in the castle was metaphorically buried, because stewards always do. Together they built the case the way you build something that has to last, carefully, without shortcuts, making sure each piece could bear the weight of what was placed on top of it. The council session where Aldrich was confronted lasted 6 hours. He denied everything for the first 4, offered partial admissions in the 5th, and collapsed entirely in the 6th. The poisoner, a court physician who had served Aldrich's interests for 12 years and finally decided that 12 years was enough, provided the final piece from a cell in the lower castle. Aldrich was removed from the council, stripped of his titles, sent to the monastery at the edge of the eastern province where powerful men went to live with the consequences of their choices. The dual coronation was formal and public and genuinely unprecedented in living memory, the great hall packed, the light streaming through the high windows, the old words spoken in the old way. Isolde stood at the left of the throne, Cale at the right, the 2 crowns, recast, as promised, reshaped from the single ancient one, but fitted to interlock when placed side by side, waited. She had refused to enter from the secondary door. They had argued about this for a week, quietly, seriously, the first of many arguments that would characterize their particular kind of partnership. Equal entry or no entry, she had said, with the flat precision of someone who had spent 20 years being made to enter through secondary doors and was finished with it. The tradition is the primary door for the acknowledged heir, he had said, not because he disagreed with her, but because he had learned already that she thought better when she had something to push against. Then the tradition is wrong and we change it, she had said, which is, in fact, the primary function of 2 people wearing crowns instead of 1. He had looked at her for a moment, and then said, "Equal entry," which was also the first of many times he would do this, arrive at her position after initial resistance and acknowledge it plainly, without performance. They walked in together, from the main doors, which swung open to a hall that did not quite know how to react, and then decided that history was happening and acted accordingly. The crowns were placed simultaneously, by Marin, who had earned that right, and by the old high priest who had been waiting 30 years for someone to give the prophecy a different ending. The hall was silent for a full 3 seconds, then it wasn't, and the sound that replaced the silence was the kind that moves through stone walls and reaches people a street away. Isolde did not smile in the performance way of people who have won something. She smiled in the private way, small and real, the smile of someone who has survived something they weren't supposed to survive. Cale caught it, because he caught everything she did, which was another habit that had formed faster than either of them had anticipated, and returned it with equal quietness and equal realness. The feast that night was enormous and loud and full of people recalibrating their understanding of what the kingdom was and who stood at the center of it now. Isolde ate sparingly and watched the room the way she always did, cataloging, assessing, making the mental notes that 20 years in a tower had made instinctive and indelible. Cale moved through the hall speaking to everyone, which he did effortlessly, which was a skill she observed with genuine admiration and absolutely no intention of replicating herself. "You don't have to work every corner of the room," he told her at one point, appearing at her side with 2 glasses of wine and the easy bearing of someone in his element. "I know," she said. "You do it so I don't have to. It works." He handed her the wine, and she took it, and they stood side by side looking out at the hall, and something settled between them that was not yet comfortable but was no longer tense. "Are you afraid?" he asked, quietly enough that only she could hear him, which was something he seemed to understand instinctively, that she preferred her honest questions delivered without an audience. "Constantly," she said, with a directness that was itself a kind of trust, "because you only admit fear to people you've decided are safe enough to see it." "Good," he said. "Me too. I think that means we're paying attention." She looked at him sidelong, that precise, considering look, and then said, "That might be the first thing you've said that I agree with completely and without any caveats." "Write it down," he said. "It may never happen again." She smiled, and this time it was not small, it was a full smile, startled into existence by someone who had managed to be genuinely funny at exactly the right moment. He looked at her smile as if he intended to keep it somewhere safe, which was a look she noticed and filed away under things she was not yet ready to examine too closely. The kingdom did not transform overnight, kingdoms never do. They are large and old and carry the momentum of everything that came before, which means change is slow and contested and exhausting. There were lords who refused to acknowledge the dual crown as legitimate. There were whisper campaigns, small rebellions, the inevitable attempt at another kind of poison, which was caught and neutralized before it got close. There were nights when Isolde sat alone in her new chambers, larger than the tower room, strange in their size and silence, and felt the full weight of what she was carrying without armor. There were mornings when Cale appeared at her door without announcement, which she had told him 3 times not to do and which she had privately stopped minding somewhere around the 2nd time. He would come in, sit in the chair by her window without being invited, which was his father's gesture, she realized, and she never told him that, because some things are private, and talk through whatever decision was pressing. She would listen, and then dissect, and then reassemble the problem in a different shape, and he would look at the new shape and see something he hadn't seen before, and that was how it worked between them. He was the face, present, magnetic, able to walk into a room full of strangers and make each one feel that he had come specifically for them. She was the architecture, invisible, foundational, the thinking that held the visible structure up when the weight of the kingdom pressed down on it from all angles simultaneously. "You should be more visible," he told her once, and she looked at him with the expression she reserved for statements that were correct on the surface and wrong underneath. "Visible people get targeted," she said. "I spent 20 years being strategically invisible, and I know things about this kingdom that you don't, because no one noticed me watching." "And I spent 20 years being strategically visible," he said, "and I know things you don't, because people tell you things when they think you're the only power in the room." They looked at each other, the understanding of it passing between them clearly, the way things pass between people who have started to think in each other's terms. "Complementary," she said. "Not competing," he agreed. This was the argument Aldrich had never understood, the one the prophecy had been making for 300 years while everyone was busy mistranslating it to suit their interests and their fears. Two crowns are not two threats. Two crowns are not two powers fighting for the same ground. Two crowns twisted together are one structure with twice the surface area and half the vulnerability. The kingdom began to feel this, slowly, the way large things feel anything, gradually, in parts, starting with the parts that were most hungry for it and spreading outward from there. Trade negotiations that had collapsed under the single crown's rigid priorities found new angles under a dual approach. Kale's warmth opening doors that Assault's precision could then build permanent structures inside. The eastern provinces, which had been restless and undertended for a generation, received attention that they had never received from a court that hadn't bothered to look east before. Isolde knew the East. She had grown up looking at it from a tower window, watching its weather, reading its petitions, understanding its particular combination of pride and neglect. She proposed a residency, a portion of each year spent not in the capital but in the eastern cities, governing from within rather than above, which was radical and controversial and effective. Kale backed it without hesitation, which was the kind of backing that mattered. Not the kind that required her to argue her case 3 times and accept half of what she'd asked for. "You don't second-guess me," she noted, once, during a quiet evening in the second year, when they were reviewing documents by firelight in the way that had become their particular version of routine. "I've watched you be wrong twice," he said, not looking up from his document. "In 14 months of daily decision-making. I'll second-guess you when the odds improve." She put down her document and looked at him, the long, level, taking measure look, and something in the equation she was running shifted its result. "That might be the second thing you've said that I agree with completely and without any caveats," she said. He looked up then, he smiled, and the smile was the same kind hers had been, startled, real, belonging to the person under the crown rather than the crown itself. They were not simple together, nothing about them was simple, nothing ever had been, and they were both too honest and too complicated for simplicity to take up residence between them. They argued, often and at length, about policy and principle and the correct interpretation of the ancient law texts and the best way to handle the border dispute with the northern lords. They disagreed about mercy. He was more generous with it, she was more calibrated, neither of them was entirely right, and their disagreement produced outcomes that neither could have reached alone. There were silences between them that were uncomfortable, not because of hostility but because of the proximity of things that hadn't been said, things that were moving closer to the surface month by month. One night, after a council session that had lasted until nearly midnight and required every diplomatic resource both of them possessed, they sat in the small room off the throne room, exhausted and still. "Can I tell you something?" he said, not quite a question, the voice of someone who has been holding something for too long and has decided the holding is now the worse option. "Yes," she said simply, because simplicity is the appropriate response to someone about to say something true and difficult. "I think about the night in the throne room," he said. "Often. More than is probably strategic." She was quiet for a moment. She was not surprised, which was its own kind of information. It meant she had been tracking the same thing from her side of the distance. "The night we could have destroyed each other," she said, and chose not to. "The night I stood next to you for the first time," he said, and realized that everything I'd been told about you was the smallest, most impoverished version of who you actually were. The fire was low, the room was warm, the kingdom was sleeping outside these walls, under two twisted crowns, unknowing and held. "I was told you were vain," she said, into the quiet. "Shallow. That you were very good-looking and very empty," which was a useful combination for a puppet king and a lethal one for a real one. "And," he said. "And you are very good-looking," she said, with the tone of someone making a concession based on evidence, "and entirely non-empty, which is personally inconvenient and politically ideal." He laughed, a full one, unguarded, the laugh of someone who has been given permission to stop performing and just be what they actually are in the presence of someone who can handle it. She watched him laugh, and the expression on her face was not the composed, watchful, giving nothing expression she wore in council chambers and diplomatic halls and every public space she occupied. It was something softer and more complicated, something that had been building since a midnight throne room and a raven on a ledge and two hands touching a crown that changed everything it touched. "Isolde," he said, when the laughter had settled, and the way he said her name was different from every other time he had said it, less careful, less formal, less managed. "I know," she said, before he could continue, which was characteristic, and which he had learned meant she had arrived there ahead of him, which was also characteristic. "Is that a problem?" he asked. She considered this with genuine seriousness. She considered everything with genuine seriousness, which was one of the things about her that had stopped feeling strange and started feeling like something he couldn't imagine navigating without. "It's complicated," she said. "We share a crown. We share a kingdom. We share a council chamber and a border dispute and a recurring disagreement about the northern lords that isn't going to resolve itself." "I know," he said. "And I don't do anything carelessly," she said. "Not even this. Especially not this." "I know that too," he said, and the patience in his voice was real and unhurried, the patience of someone who had learned that she was worth waiting for, every time. She looked at him for a long moment, the full weight of her attention on him, nothing held back, which was how she looked when she had made a decision and was executing it. "Then ask me again in the spring," she said, "when we've survived the winter and the border negotiations and whatever the Eastern lords are planning with those trade routes, and I'll give you a different answer." He held her gaze, he nodded, he did not push, which was the correct response, which was the response she had somehow known he would give even before he gave it. "Spring," he agreed. They went back to their documents, the fire burned lower, the kingdom slept, and the two crowns sat on their respective tables, side by side, almost touching, patient as everything that knows it will eventually arrive. Spring came the way it always does in kingdoms and in lives, after a winter that seemed permanent, suddenly, undeniably, with the force of something that had been building underground all along. The border negotiations concluded, the Eastern lords were brought to an agreement that satisfied nobody entirely and everybody sufficiently, which is what real agreements look like beneath the ceremonial language. The northern dispute found its resolution in a precedent Isolde had unearthed in a record from the fourth reign that no one else had thought to look for, which surprised no one who knew her. The kingdom moved, not perfectly, not without struggle, not without the constant friction of large things changing direction, but it moved, and the direction it was moving was better than the one before. On the first warm morning of the year, Cale found her in the garden she had claimed from a corner of the castle grounds, growing things, because she had asked Cale about Daniel's gardening once, in passing, and he'd told her what his old steward once said about growing things as medicine. She was kneeling in the dirt, which was not a posture most people associated with the woman who had restructured the kingdom's eastern trade policy and dismantled a 30-year political conspiracy. She heard him approach and did not turn around, which meant she had recognized his footstep, which was the kind of small thing that becomes enormous when you let yourself notice it. He sat down on the garden wall and waited, which was what he did, which was what he had always done, which was what she had decided she could trust. "It's spring," she said, still not turning around, still with her hands in the soil. "It is," he said. She sat back on her heels. She looked at her hands, dirty, capable, belonging to a woman who had survived everything the kingdom could think to put in her way. Then she stood, and turned, and looked at him in the full spring light without the strategic composure and without the watchful distance and without the careful management of expression. Just Isolde, second-born, shadow-raised, eastern tower, two twisted crowns, looking at the person who had stood beside her in the dark and chosen the harder and better path. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her, and he was not performing anything, not the king face or the diplomatic face or the public face, just Cale, firstborn, crown promised, entirely non-empty. "Will you let this be something real?" he asked. "Not managed, not strategic, not a political alliance dressed up in warmer language, but real, with everything that means for two people who are also a kingdom." She was quiet for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to be honest, short enough to be clear. "Yes," she said. One word, the same one she had said in the throne room at midnight, to the question of whether they could trust each other with the crown, and now here, in the garden, in the spring light, to a different and older and more personal question. He crossed the garden, and she let him, which was an act of will for someone who had spent 20 years keeping every person at careful, survivable distance. He took her hands, dirty from the garden, warm from the morning, and held them in the matter-of-fact way of someone who has no interest in the moment being anything other than exactly what it is. "We're going to argue about the northern lords for years," she said. "Decades, probably," he agreed. "And you're going to walk into rooms without announcing yourself for the rest of your life?" "Almost certainly," he said, without apology, which was the correct response, which made her smile. The kingdom held the two of them in the long morning, the two crowns inside on their tables, the prophecy finally reading the way it was always meant to read. Not two rivals, not two threats, not two powers grinding against each other until one of them broke. Two people, two crowns twisted into something stronger than either could be alone, two halves of a whole that the kingdom had been waiting for without knowing what it was waiting for. The raven came back that afternoon, or a raven came. In this kingdom you could never be entirely sure, and landed on the garden wall and tilted its head. Isolde looked at it, it looked back, one oil-black eye unblinking, carrying whatever it carried. "Go on," she told it. "Tell them whatever you need to tell them." It spread its wings and went, up, over the castle walls, over the city, carrying the news of the kingdom forward into whatever came next. The spring was warm, the garden was growing, the two crowns rested side by side, twisted together, as they had been prophesied to rest since before either of them was born into the weight of them. And the kingdom, old, complicated, scarred by every version of itself it had ever been, breathed out, finally, and began the slow work of becoming something it had not yet been. Something better. Something held by two instead of one. Something that knew the difference between power that controls and power that builds, between a crown that takes and a crown that carries. It would not be easy, it would never be easy, the best things never are, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you a version of the story with the hard parts removed. But it would be real, it was already real. Two twisted crowns and two people who had chosen the harder path on a midnight with dead candles and a raven on the ledge. And real is the only thing, in the end, that outlasts the stories told about it, the only thing that survives the retellings, the revisions, the inevitable attempts to make it smaller than it was. Real is what they had, real is what they had built. Real is what the kingdom would carry forward into the years that no prophecy could fully predict and no crown could entirely hold alone. Two twisted crowns, stronger together, rooted in the dark they had both survived, reaching, always, toward the light they had both decided was worth the reaching.